It's already hard to digest the fact that my father-in-law passed away, but the shocking thing my husband, Bob, said right in front of me left me stunned. Let's get divorced now that I've got the inheritance. I don't need an ATM like you anymore, he said. For a moment, I couldn't comprehend what Bob was saying. What do you mean? I asked. Bob grinned and smugly explained, I got about $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore. Bob then went on to voice his frustrations about me. Do you know how embarrassed? I had high hopes because it was a match arranged by my dad, but I was disappointed to see such a plain woman like you, he said. Well, why did you marry me then? You could have just said no, I replied. It's obvious, ain't it? For the money. Who'd marry someone like you otherwise? He sneered. There was no way I could stay silent after hearing all that. Fine, here's the divorce papers, I said. I decided to agree to the divorce from Bob without revealing something important. I hope he deeply regrets this later. My name is Catherine Smith, 42 years old. I run a fashion company. I got married to Bob, who's 2 years younger, 2 years ago. Our marriage was arranged. Bob is the son of Mr. Smith, the CEO of a company I had been dealing with for many years. Being an only child, it seemed Mr. Smith initially intended for Bob to succeed him, but Bob showed no interest, nor was he particularly skilled at his job. So, Bob quickly dropped out of the running for successor and just worked as a regular employee. What attracted me to Bob was his laid-back nature. Since childhood, people often told me I was too serious and lacked spontaneity. I was often praised for being studious, but sometimes people found me too stiff. Some of my ex-boyfriends even told me, "You're not fun, it's like I'm dating a boss." It was heartbreaking, but I always felt maybe I was too serious. Being labeled as inflexible was a common occurrence. I struggled with handling things casually and often got too engrossed. To me, Bob seemed like he was from a completely different world. Oh, the place is closed today. During our first date, Bob took me to a restaurant. He recommended, but it was closed now. I would have been flustered by such an unexpected situation, but not Bob. Let's just go to that diner over there. He changed plans effortlessly. For someone as rigid as me, his response was a revelation. I thought by being with him, I could also become adaptable. That's why I decided to marry him. Many people were against our marriage. Some even suggested I could find someone better. Even Mr. Smith, my father-in-law, wasn't very enthusiastic. You sure you want to take on my son? It feels like I'm burdening you with him, he had asked. Back then, I felt no one really understood Bob's worth, but maybe they were right. Soon after we got married, Bob quit his job without consulting anyone. He just stopped going to work. When both I and Mr. Smith inquired about the reason, Bob nonchalantly said, "Wait, why do I need to work if you are making money for us both?" My father-in-law and I were so taken aback by this that we were at a loss for words. Why would he rely solely on me for income? I tried to persuade Bob multiple times afterward with my father-in-law, but Bob's mindset never changed. After all, even if I work, I can't make as much as Catherine. I was tempted to divorce Bob right after our marriage when he boldly declared he'd be a freeloader. If he was a young man in his 20s, I might have found this cute, but this tantrum was coming from a man approaching 40. In the end, we begrudgingly agreed that he'd do the household chores. Bob's parents had divorced a few years earlier. Apparently, before the divorce, Bob's mother wasn't particularly good at housework. She couldn't do anything, so I never learned anything from her. It seemed like Bob was making excuses, blaming his mother for his lack of domestic skills. True to his word, at first, Bob was clueless about housework. But with persistent praise and guidance, he managed to handle basic tasks. However, that doesn't mean he became exceptionally good at it. Still, he looked quite satisfied with himself, thanks to me taking care of the house. Catherine can work, you should be grateful. There was something about Bob's confident expression that rubbed me the wrong way, but it wasn't worth making a fuss about. Yes, Bob, I'm really grateful for your help, I said, forcing a smile. There were times I got irritated, but I think we managed to get along quite well. About a year into our marriage, a significant event occurred. My father-in-law adopted a child, a 9-year-old boy named Jack. Jack seemed like any ordinary boy. My father-in-law is the type of person who doesn't make senseless decisions. So why did he suddenly adopt Jack? One day when we were alone, I asked him. He replied, "Promise you won't tell anyone," and then explained. It turns out Jack was the child of an employee whom my father-in-law had been fond of, having had a close relationship with the family. My father-in-law cared for Jack like a grandson. Tragically, a while back, Jack's parents died in an accident. Jack's parents had eloped, and he had no close relatives to rely on. Otherwise, he would have ended up in a foster home. While my father-in-law wasn't sure if Jack would be happy with us, he decided to adopt him, hoping it'd be for the best. I see, that's very kind of you, I responded. Although Bob and I didn't have children, we had quite a bit of freedom. Please rely on me if you need anything. Upon hearing this, my father-in-law smiled warmly. After that, thankfully, my father-in-law relied on me from time to time, just as I had asked, on nights when he absolutely couldn't make it back from work or when he had pressing commitments. I took care of Jack. At first, Jack was a bit apprehensive, but he warmed up quickly. He's either very friendly or trying hard to fit in. Thinking about it made me feel somewhat emotional. Bob, on the other hand, wasn't thrilled about the situation. It seemed he wasn't exactly welcoming toward Jack. I could understand his mixed feelings, knowing his father took in a stranger. But when I tried talking to Bob, it turned out he had a completely different concern. Adopting him? What's he thinking? This is going to cut into my inheritance. I was hoping to get everything. I couldn't believe my ears. Bob wasn't feeling conflicted about Jack. He was worried about the inheritance. I'm going to talk to Dad about this. I'm not cool with it. One day, Bob said this and went to confront his father. When he returned after a while, to my surprise, he was in a strangely good mood. I cautiously asked a smiling Bob, "How did it go?" He replied, "Oh, it's all good. My share isn't changing." Huh, what do you mean? I always thought that even an adopted child like Jack had the same inheritance rights as a biological child. What's going on here? Noticing my confusion, Bob smugly explained, "Dad's making Jack give up his inheritance rights." Makes sense. I'm his only son, after all. Could the father-in-law who spoke of Jack with such affection really plan on leaving him nothing after his passing? Something didn't sit right with me. I wasn't convinced, but Bob said with relief, "I'm glad." Well, if my father-in-law says so, there must be a reason behind it. Either way, he is still in his 60s. We probably won't be dealing with any inheritance for a while. In fact, it seems more likely that I divorce Bob before my father-in-law passes away. I was nonchalantly pondering such thoughts. However, that moment came much sooner than expected. A year later, my father-in-law was involved in an accident and never came back. I never thought I'd say goodbye to him so soon. I've known my father-in-law longer than I've known Bob. He was a respectable man, both in his professional and private life. After hearing the news, I was overcome with a sense of loss, and tears wouldn't stop flowing. My eyes heavy from crying and my head throbbing, I forced myself to prepare for the funeral. Bob was the main mourner, but he didn't seem to be grieving. He just seemed distant. His father had passed away so suddenly. Perhaps Bob was in such shock that it didn't feel real. I had to step up and make preparations to bid farewell to my father-in-law on behalf of Bob. I felt like crying, but somehow held back during the funeral. As hard as it was for me, seeing Jack cry was the most heartbreaking. Throughout it all, Bob didn't shed a single tear. That's when I began to find his behavior peculiar. Rather than grieving, Bob seemed restless or even giddy. Sometime after the commotion, the reason became clear. Bob, isn't something off with you? Aren't you sad about your dad's passing? I intended my comment to reflect concern about his lack of tears, but his response caught me off guard. Of course I'm sad, but I'm also kind of thrilled. Oops, guess my joy showed, huh? Come on, Catherine, Dad was the CEO, right? He's found to have some money. How much do you think he left behind? I had thought Bob was just zoning out, but from before the funeral up to now, he hadn't been mourning his father at all. Instead, he was grinning, thinking about the inheritance. What on earth are you thinking? Well, think about it. We're divorced, and my mom doesn't have any of it. I'm his only blood child. Jack, being adopted, won't inherit anything, so all the inheritance is mine. Do you think I can't be thrilled about that? Bob had a face that looked like he was about to burst into laughter at any moment. Seeing that face made me feel like I was going to slap him. Bob's face had relaxed so much, he was truly delighted from the bottom of his heart that my father-in-law had passed away. I can't believe it, I said. Say whatever you want. I just wanted to leave right then, but before that, there was something I had to tell Bob about Jack. Now that my father-in-law was gone, I had temporarily asked Bob to keep Jack at our place. But if things continued like this, Jack would have to go to a foster home. In that case, I wanted to raise Jack with my own hands. That's what I was thinking about Jack. Yeah, you going to take him in? Sounds good to me. I was surprised by how easily Bob agreed. He continued with a smile, after all, what you do, Catherine, has absolutely nothing to do with me anymore. Then he held up a single piece of paper to me. It was a green paper, a divorce paper. What's this? I asked, confused. Bob crisply replied, let's get a divorce. Now that I've got the inheritance, I don't need my personal ATM, you anymore. For a moment, I didn't understand what Bob was saying. Did he just call me an ATM and say I'm no longer needed? What do you mean? Bob smirked and proudly told me I got around $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore. Bob continued, with this much, I don't have to work anymore. I don't need to please you. I don't have to bother with tedious chores. Oh, how wonderful. With exaggerated gestures, Bob openly expressed his joy. I was deeply shocked seeing this side of Bob. The inheritance was money that came in after my stepfather's death. Yet he's rejoicing as if he won the lottery. As I've been feeling, Bob doesn't seem to mourn or remember my father-in-law. He's genuinely happy. But money is a scary thing. It's not uncommon for people to change dramatically after getting a huge sum. Perhaps with such a large amount in front of him, Bob's just getting a bit carried away. Calm down, Bob. Let's talk first, I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. But Bob quickly shrugged it off and shouted at me with fury. Shut up, you boring woman. I married you because you were introduced by my father and you were a CEO, but I always felt suffocated with you. It's hard for me. Bob listed his grievances against me. I was so disappointed when I expected someone better from the arranged date my dad set up, but then got someone plain like you. If that's the case, he could have just refused the match. I never forced him or passionately persuaded him to marry me. Being portrayed as the victim didn't sit right with me. So why did you marry me then? If you had declined, that would have been fine. It's obvious, for the money. Who else would marry someone like you? Bob laughed at me, mocking. Basically, he married me for my wealth. Bob started with, it's been a while, so I guess it's safe to say, and revealed a shocking fact. I had a significant debt. My dad said if I change my ways and devote myself to you, he would pay it off. So of course I would marry you. It meant he never loved me. He just married me for the money. Well, it wasn't fun, but thanks to you, I was saved. Thanks a lot. Seeing Bob laughing crudely, I made up my mind. I don't know this man anymore. I decided not to give him the advice I had planned on and just started filling out the divorce papers. Without hesitation, I wrote without pausing or second-guessing. Bob, who had been urging the divorce, seemed a bit surprised to see this. Hey, are you thinking of getting a divorce now? Fine, here's the divorce papers. After writing them, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Now we're total strangers. Yeah, whatever happens now doesn't concern the other. You can live with that, kid. Jack and I can hang out with younger women. We're free. Bob was ecstatic from what I could see. He hadn't cheated during our marriage. I never suspected it, but that was a point of interest. But Bob, if you were this happy about it, you should have divorced sooner. I had my reasons. I wanted the money. Bob carelessly stuffed the divorce papers into his bag and left the house in a hurry. I didn't feel right staying in the house where I'd lived with Bob. I was thinking of starting fresh somewhere new with Jack. This seemed like a good time to sell the house and move. I'd love to live close to my parents' place. I think it would help both Jack and me. Jack will have to transfer schools, but he said that's okay. It's a bit sad, but now we can look for a new place without any reservations. Finding a new place was a bit of a challenge, but after some thought, I made a choice. The main deciding factors were the short distance to my parents and the great location. It's pricey, but considering Jack, I think it's the best property out there. Jack accompanied me to view the property, and his eyes lit up at the sight of the luxurious house. It's spacious and elaborately decorated. There's plenty of storage, which was a concern of mine, and surprisingly, it even came with a pool. Honestly, I didn't need a pool, but seeing Jack's excitement made it worth it. Wow, this is amazing. It would have been fine for me to live anywhere, but seeing him happy was what mattered most. And so we moved. It took a while for both Jack and me to adjust, but eventually our new house became a comforting place. Around that time, I got a call from Bob. He seemed desperate and said he wanted to meet and apologize immediately. I had an idea why he'd suddenly say that. I could have ignored him, but since he was so insistent, I decided to meet. I left Jack with my mother and headed to the diner I had specified. Bob had arrived earlier. He was sitting in a corner booth, looking pale and on the verge of tears. Catherine, I gave Bob a cold look as he stood up upon seeing me. What do you want, Bob? We're supposed to be strangers now. Don't say that. The truth is my dad had debts. Damn. I never thought he'd. So what, you inherited $1 million, right? Just pay it off. No, the debts, they're more than the inheritance. It seemed the debt exceeded the $1 million inheritance, so after inheriting both the assets and the liabilities, Bob was now saddled with debt. I didn't know I'd inherit the debt too. Bob looked defeated. Please, Catherine. You must have some savings. We were married once. Please help me out, he pleaded with a flattering smile. Did Bob even remember what he said before? After all the times you belittled me, even calling me an ATM, who would want to help you now? It was audacious of him to contact me. He'd said over the phone that he wanted to apologize. But he hasn't done so yet. Yet you really regretted our marriage, didn't you? After everything you said, how can you ask for help now? Well, back then, I never imagined this would happen. His convenience astounded me. He probably thought he wouldn't need money from me anymore, but now that he does, he's grinning. It seemed that way. Sorry, but I can't meet your expectations. I don't have the money. What are you talking about? I know your business is thriving. Liar. I wish he'd stop blaming me, an innocent bystander, for his own mistakes. I'm not lying. I just don't have the money to lend to you. Not every bank lends to everyone, right? Why would I lend if I don't expect it back? Bob remembered the harsh words he once threw at me and looked a bit guilty, yet he doesn't apologize. Such a proud man. What's with a cold shoulder? Don't you care what happens to me? Oh, did you forget what you said when we got divorced? We're strangers now, nothing to do with each other. Weren't those your words? I don't understand how he can act like he's the victim. How thick-skinned can he be? Does he have the ability to forget everything that doesn't suit him? I wish I had recorded what he said back then and could play it back to him. I might have said something like that, but I didn't mean it. I never imagined things would turn out this way. Bob leaned on the table, looking sad. I thought about the life insurance, but my dad's lawyer said I'm not the beneficiary. Oh, really? I laughed at his statement, which made Bob look at me in shock. You don't think Catherine did my dad leave it to you? No, it's not me. Then why'd you laugh? Just felt a bit sorry for you, that's all. If it was insurance, I wouldn't have inherited the debts. Exactly. That's why my father-in-law had Jack renounce the inheritance. He had left something for Jack in the form of life insurance. The beneficiary of my father-in-law's life insurance was Jack. Is that all you wanted to talk about? If so, I'm leaving. There's nothing I can't do for you. Wait, can't we start over? I was just upset about my dad back then, but I truly care about you, Catherine. You mean you only see me as a dollar sign, right? I know Bob was denying and saying all sorts of things, but I'm not getting fooled again. After all, I don't have a single dime to give to someone like him. Well, someone important is waiting for me at home. With that, I left the diner. I could hear Bob crying out in a pitiful manner, but to me it was just noise. I need to hurry home. Jack might be hungry, or maybe he got something from his grandma. I quickly headed to the subway station. As for Bob, I heard he's working multiple part-time jobs to pay off his debts. With no work experience, qualifications, or motivation, he couldn't get a full-time job anywhere. I once saw him working at a convenience store while I was on my way to a client. He looked much older and thinner, quite shocking. Bob, who had been living off others, was now facing the consequences. There's no sympathy for him. On the other hand, I'm living peacefully with Jack. We even argue sometimes. Now, it's saddening when Jack ignores me after a fight, but I try to see it as a sign that he's opening up to me. I plan to support him until he can stand on his own 2 feet. That's probably what my father-in-law wished for, and it's my goal in life now.